It was one of those late Tuesday afternoons in Asheville where the sky is the color of steel and the air feels heavy enough to press on your shoulders. I had just wrapped up the last email for the day when I saw the little peach-colored slip from the Postal Service stuck in my front door. Certified mail. I didn't think much of it. Usually it's boring stuff like bank notices or tax forms. The next day I swung by the post office after work. The place smelled faintly of dust and printer toner, with the soft hum of a sorting machine in the back. The clerk handed me a thick, stiff envelope. As soon as I saw the return address, a law office, I felt a little twinge in my stomach, like a warning. When I got home, I sat at the kitchen table, the late afternoon light spilling across the wood. I slid my finger under the seal, and that's when my stomach dropped. Inside were official court documents, my name listed in bold as the defendant. The plaintiff? My wife, Laura Turner. The problem was, Laura had been dead for over a year. It was like the room tilted sideways. My vision narrowed until all I could see was her name in black ink. I read the header 3 times, thinking maybe I had misunderstood. But no, there it was, plain as day. Laura Turner versus Michael Turner. I could hear my own pulse in my ears as I picked up the phone and dialed the number for the attorney listed on the paperwork. When a man answered, his voice was crisp and practiced, the way lawyers tend to sound. I explained calmly at first that there must be some mistake. Laura couldn't be suing anyone because she passed away last March, complications after what was supposed to be a routine surgery. There was silence on the line. Not just the polite pause people use to gather their thoughts, but a dead, weighty silence. I could almost imagine the lawyer glancing at his files, then back at the phone, not quite sure what to say. Finally, his voice cracked slightly. "Mr. Turner, could you repeat that?" I did. I told him Laura had been buried in Maplewood Cemetery for over 13 months, that I'd stood by her grave myself, holding the folded American flag her cousin had brought, because Laura's father served in the Navy, and she always said she was proud of that. When I finished, the lawyer cleared his throat and admitted he was uncertain how this could have happened. But something in his tone told me this wasn't going to be some clerical error that got sorted out in a week. I hung up and just sat there, staring at the papers, feeling the quiet hum of the refrigerator behind me. This was the beginning of something I couldn't quite name yet, but I knew it wasn't good. In that moment, my mind went back to something Laura once told me, half joking, while we were fixing a leaky faucet. "If there's money on the table, Michael, my family will sniff it out like bloodhounds." At the time, I laughed. Now, holding these papers, the laugh felt like it belonged to another life. That night, I couldn't bring myself to put the lawsuit papers away. They sat on the kitchen table like some poisonous thing, the black ink glaring under the soft yellow light. I must have read Laura Turner 100 times, each one hitting me with the same jolt of disbelief. Sleep didn't come easy. My mind kept wandering back to March 16th of last year, the day I watched my wife slip away. It had been a routine gallbladder surgery. Nothing dramatic, nothing we were warned to worry about, but hours after the procedure, Laura had a sudden allergic reaction to one of the post-operative medications. It was violent and fast. Her face flushed deep red, her breathing turned shallow, then ragged. The doctors moved quickly, voices low but urgent, the steady beeping of the heart monitor climbing in pitch. I remember gripping the cold metal rail of her hospital bed, feeling helpless in a way I'd never felt before. Even now, I can still smell the antiseptic in that room, sharp and almost metallic, like it's burned into my memory. Laura was just 34. We had been married for 8 years. 8 years of building a modest but good life together. We had our little 2-bedroom house on the edge of Asheville, a backyard where she grew tomatoes and old whiskey barrels, and a joint savings account we kept for vacations we never got to take. She had a small stake in an agrochemical company, a retirement account from her previous job, and a beat-up Subaru she adored. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. More importantly, we were happy. Her family, Denise and Brian, were a different story. They lived about 2 hours away, and in all those years I could count on one hand the number of times they visited. Most of those visits happened when they needed something, a loan, a couch to sleep on, or Laura's help with some mess they'd gotten themselves into. Laura used to joke, if I ever won the lottery, I'd have to move and change my name before telling them. She loved them because they were family, but she never trusted them. And I'll admit, I never understood the depth of that distrust until the months after she was gone. The funeral had been small, just close friends, a few neighbors, and her family. I remember Denise standing near the casket, not crying, not even looking at Laura for long. Instead, she asked me in a quiet but pointed way whether Laura had left any instructions about her things. Brian made a few offhand comments about family heirlooms that Laura supposedly wanted him to have. At the time, I was too numb to process it. Grief has a way of narrowing your focus. Every sound is muffled, every movement feels slow. You latch onto the smallest task just to keep breathing. So when they asked about her belongings, I assumed it was their awkward way of coping. I didn't think about it again. After the funeral, the legal part was straightforward. Laura had died without a will, which meant, under North Carolina's intestacy laws, everything went to me, the surviving spouse. Our house, our joint bank accounts, her retirement account, all in my name. My probate attorney made sure every step was handled by the book, so there would be no question later. By the summer, I thought everything was settled. I was still learning to live without her. Quiet mornings without coffee brewing, no more texts in the middle of the day asking what I wanted for dinner. But legally, at least, I thought the chapter was closed. I was wrong. As I sat there now with those lawsuit papers in front of me, I realized this wasn't just a legal misunderstanding, this was Denise and Brian's doing. And if Laura had been right about them all along, then this was just the opening move in whatever they had planned.
2 days after that phone call with the bewildered attorney, I was sitting in the downtown office of my probate lawyer, Daniel Morris. Daniel had helped me navigate every step after Laura's death, patient, thorough, and never making me feel like I was just another case file. His office smelled faintly of leather and old paper, the kind of scent that makes you think of history books and law libraries. Outside the tall windows, Asheville's streets were busy with lunchtime traffic, but inside, it was quiet enough to hear the soft ticking of a wall clock. I handed him the lawsuit papers. Daniel put on his reading glasses and went through them slowly, occasionally making a note on a yellow legal pad. I sat there with my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold 5 minutes after he poured it. When he finally set the papers down, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Michael," he said, "this has all the hallmarks of what we call a fishing expedition. They're throwing out big, vague claims, hoping you'll pay them to go away." He explained that under North Carolina's intestacy laws, when a married person dies without a will, the surviving spouse inherits everything before any other relatives, unless there are children, which Laura and I didn't have. Since our house, our accounts, and her investments were all jointly held, Denise and Brian had no automatic claim to any of it. "Then why even bother filing?" I asked. Daniel shrugged. 2 reasons. Either someone gave them bad legal advice, or they think you're too grief-stricken to fight a long battle. He paused, giving me a look that said he was betting on the second reason. That comment lit a slow fire in my chest. I wasn't going to let them mistake my grief for weakness. Daniel's strategy was simple. Collect every piece of documentation we had: marriage certificate, property deeds, bank records, beneficiary forms from Laura's retirement accounts. Put it all in order and make the case airtight. But before filing our official response, he wanted to confirm who was really behind this. His paralegal started digging that afternoon, and it didn't take long. The plaintiff wasn't Laura Turner at all. It was Denise Carter, with Brian Carter listed as a supporting plaintiff. They were alleging that I had unfairly taken assets that should have been part of Laura's estate and distributed among her blood relatives. I could feel my jaw tighten as Daniel read their claims aloud. Millions of dollars in damages, accusations that Laura had property and business investments solely in her name that I had wrongfully absorbed. Even a bizarre allegation that I had manipulated her into changing her will, which was laughable because she'd never had one. It was as if they had built a fantasy version of Laura's life, one where she'd been secretly wealthy and estranged from me. The reality was that every asset they mentioned had been jointly purchased, jointly owned, or explicitly listed with me as the beneficiary. Daniel closed the folder and looked me square in the eyes. "Michael," he said, "this has all the hallmarks of what we call a fishing expedition. They're throwing out big, vague claims, hoping you'll pay them to go away. My advice? We hit them head on." And right there, in that quiet office, I made a promise to myself and to Laura's memory that I would.
2 months later, I walked up the granite steps of the Buncombe County Courthouse for the first hearing. The air was crisp, the kind of early fall morning in North Carolina where you can smell damp leaves mixed with the faint exhaust of passing buses. My stomach felt tight, like I'd swallowed a fist. Daniel met me at the top of the steps, his leather briefcase in one hand, a paper coffee cup in the other. He gave me a nod, calm, steady, the way you want your lawyer to look when you're about to be dragged into a fight. Inside, the courtroom was colder than I expected. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the polished wooden benches creaked under the shuffle of people taking their seats. Denise and Brian sat on the other side of the aisle with their attorney, a man in an expensive gray suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Denise kept her arms folded, her eyes fixed straight ahead, not once looking in my direction. Brian looked restless, drumming his fingers on the table. When the judge entered, everyone rose. Her presence was commanding, the kind of person who could silence a room without raising her voice. She invited the plaintiff's attorney to present his opening statement. His speech was vague, filled with broad strokes about family rights and blood inheritance. He spoke as if it were a moral issue rather than a legal one, weaving a narrative about how close family bonds should be honored after a loved one passes. Not once did he produce a specific document to back his claims, just a lot of talk about what should happen. When it was Daniel's turn, he stood with the quiet confidence of a man holding a winning hand. He laid out our case in simple terms. Laura and I were legally married, all major assets were jointly owned, and she had no will. He produced our marriage certificate, property deeds showing joint ownership, bank statements with both our names, and beneficiary designations from her retirement accounts. Each document was neatly tabbed, handed up to the judge like evidence in a crime drama. The judge listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes. At one point, she turned to Denise's lawyer and asked, "Do you have any concrete evidence of separate property held by the deceased at the time of her death?" The lawyer hesitated, then mumbled something about ongoing discovery. Her next question cut even deeper. "And are you aware of the legal implications of North Carolina's intestacy laws in the absence of a will?" By the time she adjourned the hearing, I could tell she wasn't fully convinced by their side. She allowed the case to move forward into the discovery phase, but there was a faint skepticism in her tone, like she was already bracing herself for their argument to crumble. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt a mix of relief and frustration. Relief because Daniel's presentation had been rock solid. Frustration because this meant months more of digging through records, answering motions, and reliving every detail of Laura's passing. It was only the first round, and already I could feel how exhausting this was going to be. But as Daniel reminded me on the courthouse steps, "Michael, cases like this aren't won in one day. They're won piece by piece." I nodded, not yet knowing just how deep this was about to go.
The discovery phase began like most people imagine. Boxes of documents, endless requests for records, and the kind of legal back and forth that could drain the life out of anyone. Daniel told me it might feel slow at first, but every page we examined was a potential weapon for either side. A few weeks in, we received our first batch of evidence from Denise and Brian's attorney. At first glance, it looked official. Property deeds, bank statements, and a few typed letters supposedly from Laura's former business associates. But Daniel's brow furrowed almost immediately. "Something's off," he said, running a finger along the header of a property deed. "These numbers don't match the county records." We pulled up the official deed for the same property through the county's online database. Sure enough, the document in our hands had different ownership percentages and an altered date. The signatures at the bottom looked strange, like someone had traced over them. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Michael, I think we might be looking at forgery." The word hit me like a cold gust of wind. It was one thing to be dragged into court over a bogus claim. It was another to realize they might have fabricated evidence to back it up. Daniel didn't waste time. He called in a forensic document examiner he'd worked with on fraud cases before, a quiet, methodical man named Carl, whose office smelled faintly of coffee and old ink. Carl spread the documents out under a bright desk lamp and studied them like a jeweler inspecting diamonds. After 2 hours, he had his conclusion. These have been digitally altered. Whoever did it used a real document as a base, but changed key details, dates, numbers, and signatures. The more we looked, the worse it got. The bank statements they submitted showed accounts supposedly in Laura's name alone, but the formatting didn't match that bank's official records. The fonts were slightly off, and Carl spotted signs of cut and paste work on the headers. Then there were the signatures, jagged in places where Laura's real signature flowed smoothly. I'd seen her sign enough birthday cards and mortgage papers to know instantly these weren't hers. Daniel tapped his pen on the table. "If this holds up, this is no longer just a civil matter. This is criminal fraud." That night, I sat in my living room staring at a photo of Laura on our last anniversary, her hand in mine, a silver bracelet catching the sunlight. I thought about how furious she would be knowing her own sister and brother were faking her signature to try and take what wasn't theirs. It was in that moment I realized this fight wasn't just about me keeping what belonged to us. It was about defending her memory from being twisted into something ugly.
The next morning, Daniel called me into his office. His voice over the phone had that clipped, deliberate tone that told me something important was about to happen. When I walked in, the forged documents from the day before were spread out across his desk like pieces of a crime scene. "Michael," he said, "we're taking this to the district attorney." He explained that document forgery, especially involving court evidence, wasn't just unethical, it was a felony in North Carolina. And from what Carl had uncovered, we weren't talking about 1 or 2 altered pages. We were looking at multiple forged deeds, bank statements, and letters, all clearly designed to create the illusion that Laura had separate assets her family could claim. An hour later, we were in a meeting with a detective from the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office. Detective Karen Hensley was a compact woman with sharp eyes and the kind of calm demeanor that told you she'd seen every trick in the book. She listened as Daniel walked her through each forged document, then studied me carefully. "Mr. Turner," she said, "if what you're telling me checks out, this isn't just civil fraud. This is attempted theft by deception, identity fraud, and forgery, all felonies. And the fact that they submitted these in an active court case, that's going to make it worse for them." She asked for permission to contact Laura's former business associates and financial institutions. I agreed immediately. If Denise and Brian had been trying to redirect money or claim benefits, I wanted it on the record. Within 2 weeks, the detective had more than enough to confirm our suspicions. Denise and Brian had contacted Laura's old investment firm, falsely claiming to be her legal heirs. They'd also tried to reroute a quarterly payment from her small agrochemical stake into an account they controlled. Even more brazen, they had attempted to file a claim on a life insurance policy through Laura's former employer, despite me being the sole beneficiary. When Daniel got the news, he leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and said, "Well, they just handed us the win." But for me, it wasn't about winning anymore. It was about the sheer audacity of what they were willing to do. These weren't desperate, grieving relatives making a bad decision in the heat of the moment. This was calculated, planned, and it had probably started the day Laura died. That night, I sat in the quiet of my living room, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, and thought about something Laura once said during an argument with Denise years ago. They think family is a free pass to take whatever they want. Back then, I'd thought it was an exaggeration. Now, I knew it was the truth. The civil case was still moving forward, but it was no longer the only fight. The DA was opening a criminal case. Denise and Brian were about to face consequences far heavier than losing a lawsuit.
A few nights after meeting with Detective Hensley, the weight of it all finally caught up to me. It was just past midnight. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the old wooden floors as they settled. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Laura and I had eaten dinner together almost every night for 8 years. In front of me was her wedding ring. I'd taken it from the small wooden box where I kept the few things I couldn't bear to part with. Her favorite scarf, the silver bracelet she wore on her last anniversary, a faded photo from our first trip to the Outer Banks. I held the ring in my hand, running my thumb over the smooth gold band. The memories came in like waves. I could hear her laugh on that road trip to the Blue Ridge Mountains, the way she'd lean her head back and close her eyes when the wind rushed in through the open window. I could smell the faint trace of her perfume, the kind that mixed soft floral with a hint of vanilla, like it still clung to the fabric of our couch. And then, inevitably, my mind snapped back to the present, to Denise and Brian sitting in some kitchen of their own, plotting to erase every bit of what Laura and I had built. It wasn't just greed anymore. It was vandalism of her memory. The thought nearly broke me. My chest felt heavy, my vision blurred, and I found myself gripping the ring so tightly it pressed into my palm. For a moment I thought about walking away from all of it, letting the courts handle whatever they wanted, just to stop the constant tension that had settled into my bones. But then I heard Laura's voice in my head. Not the soft, playful voice from lazy Sunday mornings, but the firm, determined tone she used when something mattered. "Don't let them decide who I was, Michael." That was all it took. I set the ring back in its box, closed the lid, and made myself a quiet promise. I would see this fight through to the very end, no matter how long it took, no matter how ugly it got. Because protecting what we had wasn't just about money. It was about making sure Laura's story ended the way she lived it, with dignity.
By the time December rolled around, the case felt like it had been dragging on for years instead of months. But this was it, the final hearing, the day everything would be laid bare. I arrived at the Buncombe County Courthouse early, the sky still dark with the tail end of winter morning. The cold air bit at my cheeks as I climbed the granite steps. Inside, the familiar hum of fluorescent lights and the faint scent of polished wood brought back memories of our first hearing, but today felt different. This was the finish line. Daniel was already there, sorting through a thick binder of evidence. "We've got them, Michael," he said quietly, without even looking up. "Just stay calm." When the judge entered and called the case, Denise and Brian looked nothing like they had in the beginning. Denise's shoulders were slumped, her hair pulled back hastily. Brian kept his eyes on the table, his restless energy replaced by something heavier, like dread. Their new attorney, a public defender, sat between them, flipping nervously through his notes. The plaintiffs were up first. Their lawyer tried to soften the impact of the forged documents, calling them misunderstandings and clerical errors. But the judge wasn't buying it. She cut in more than once, asking pointedly why multiple documents had different fonts, altered dates, and mismatched signatures. Then it was Daniel's turn. He started with the basics: our marriage certificate, Laura's death certificate, joint property deeds, and bank statements. One by one, he laid out the paper trail, showing that every major asset was jointly owned or had me listed as the sole beneficiary. Then came the knockout blow. Daniel called the forensic document examiner, Carl, to the stand. Calm and precise, Carl explained exactly how each forged document had been altered, highlighting discrepancies in dates, ownership details, and signatures. He even showed enlarged images of the fake signatures compared to Laura's real ones, pointing out the hesitations in the pen strokes. From my seat, I saw the judge's expression shift from patient listening to unmistakable disapproval. By the time Daniel finished, the case against me had been dismantled piece by piece, like a wall crumbling in slow motion. The judge didn't even take a recess before delivering her decision. She said, "Case dismissed with prejudice." Then, after a pause, she looked directly at Denise and Brian. "Based on the evidence presented, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation." It was the first time I'd seen genuine shock on their faces. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in months. But this wasn't over, not for them. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was the one carrying the burden.
Within weeks of the judge's ruling, the district attorney formally filed charges against Denise and Brian: document forgery, attempted fraud, and theft by deception. Each charge was a felony, and combined they were looking at the possibility of real prison time. That's when their tone changed. The same people who had walked into court with smug expressions months earlier were now leaving frantic voicemails on my phone. Denise's messages swung wildly. One day she'd be tearful, saying she never meant for it to go this far, and the next she'd be defensive, blaming bad legal advice. Brian's approach was different. He sent a letter through his attorney claiming he had been misled by Denise and that his role had been minimal. The letter read like someone trying to climb out of a sinking boat without getting wet. They both wanted the same thing: for me to ask the DA to drop the criminal charges. They offered to pay my legal fees, to sign whatever documents I wanted, anything to make the case go away. But I wasn't interested in making it go away. Not anymore. Daniel and I pushed ahead with our own civil counterclaim, demanding repayment for the $38,000 I'd spent in legal fees, plus additional damages for emotional distress. Their new attorney, clearly more pragmatic than the last, advised them to settle rather than drag it out. 3 months later, we reached an agreement. Denise and Brian would pay me $45,000 in total, enough to cover my expenses and provide some compensation for the months of stress they'd caused. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. The criminal case, however, was still moving forward. The DA wasn't going to back down just because we'd settled the civil side. From what I heard, plea negotiations were already underway. For me, the settlement brought a certain closure. Not the kind where you forget what happened, but the kind where you know you stood your ground. I'd kept my promise to Laura not to let them rewrite her story or steal what we'd built together. And now, for the first time in almost a year, I felt like I could finally take a deep breath.
Spring came early that year in Asheville. The dogwoods were already blooming by late March, their white petals drifting onto the sidewalks like slow snow. I found myself walking to Maplewood Cemetery more often, sometimes without even meaning to. One Saturday morning, I stood by Laura's grave, the cool breeze carrying the scent of cut grass from a caretaker's mower somewhere down the hill. I brushed a few stray petals off the headstone and read her name again, the way I always did, like it was both a comfort and a reminder. I told her what had happened, how the judge had seen through every lie, how Denise and Brian had been forced to pay back what they tried to take, how the criminal charges were still hanging over them like storm clouds they couldn't outrun. And then I told her the part that mattered most, that I had kept my promise. This whole ordeal had taught me more than I ever wanted to know about grief, about greed, and about the law. I learned that when someone dies, especially someone with even modest assets, it can bring out the absolute worst in people. Titles like sister or brother don't always mean loyalty. Sometimes they're just words. I also learned the value of keeping records, of knowing your legal rights, and of having someone like Daniel in your corner, a lawyer who treats your fight as his own.
Without that, Denise and Brian might have gotten away with it. Most of all, I learned that grief can make you want to avoid conflict, to let things slide just to keep from reopening wounds. But sometimes the fight is the only way to protect the memory of the person you lost. I placed my hand on the headstone and whispered, "They didn't win, Laura. Justice did." The wind rustled the trees overhead, and for a moment I could almost hear her laugh, the one that used to fill our kitchen on Saturday mornings when she made pancakes too big for the pan. I walked out of Maplewood Cemetery that day feeling lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because the part I could control, the part where I stood up for us, was done, and I knew wherever she was, Laura would understand.